Hey there, beautiful people! How's everything? Just a little heads up before we start the video. First, yes, there's going to be spoilers regarding the work being discussed. But hold up a second. Before you throw your Wi-Fi router or cell phone out of the window, let me just say something. Although I may reveal some plot points, like the fact that Bruce Willis is a ghost in Die Hard, or that John Wick goes back in time to avoid flunking in history.
No way!
The whole emotional impact, the quality of the story, and the relevance of the events will be maintained. So it won't be that much of a problem if you know a thing or two beforehand. In other words, the intent of this video is not to tell the plot, but to use it as a way to approach the themes that the story addresses. So if you have already seen, played or read whatever it is we are talking about and realize that I left out some details, that's the reason. Although, rest assured, if you decide to leave this video for later, I'll understand. I mean it. I'll still love you. Second, if you really want it, I'd love that you like this video, share it and subscribe, as well as follow on Twitter and Instagram. It would mean the world to me, really, but then again, only if you feel like it. Being the first to do something, even if you end up being extremely influential, doesn't mean you're going to be the most famous. Being the first is not the same thing as being remembered. We can see this in some games, such as the first Uncharted and Demon's Souls, both from the PS3. Although they were very well made and fun, it was their sequels that were in the magazine's covers and in a way, shaped the gaming industry. The Wolfenstein franchise deserves attention because it achieved the feat of being the first in something. Twice. The game that started the franchise, Castle Wolfenstein, developed by Muse Software in 1981, is one of the first games in the stealth genre, which is focused on furtivity. Taking place during the Second World War, the protagonist is a spy of the Allies who must steal documents from the Nazis and escape from the castle. It can even be said that, seeing that the game has put together several very advanced gameplay elements, such as going unnoticed, wearing uniform to disguise yourself, and making enemies surrender, that it is the prototype of what a stealth game should be. After the first game, the saga would make history again in 1992, with the release of its new version, Wolfenstein 3D, made by id Software. Look, beautiful people, I never know if it's ID or id, so please, if I'm wrong, correct me in the comments. The main take of the story is still the same, but this is where the franchise began to flirt with exaggeration. Instead of setting for escaping from the castle with the secret plans, the adventure ends the only way it should end, a confrontation between our protagonist, who now has a name that will accompany him in our games, villain BJ Blazkowicz, and none other than Hitler himself, inside a mechanized armor. And then they say the games aren't art. The revolution this time is due to the fact that the game is not a 100% adaptation of the original. Embracing fast, combat-focused gameplay, the game abandoned the genre that its predecessor created so that it could create a new one, first-person shooter. I'm not trying to say that these games were not good or famous, far from that. After all, Wolfenstein 3D is considered by many publications as one of the greatest games ever made. However, the next game from id Software would simply overshadow Wolfenstein's success. After all, we're talking about Doom. So much so that, after both games were released, the other shooting games were called Doom clones, and not Wolfenstein clones. If I can share a quick personal story, when I had turned 7 or 8 years old, maybe even before, my aunt bought a computer game for me, and I remember her saying that I could rest assured about the quality, because she had asked for a game as good as Doom. And well, she didn't mention Wolfenstein. Although the saga did not have a routine relevance like other similar works, such as games like Half-Life, it wasn't stuck in the past. In 2001, the excellent Return to Castle Wolfenstein, made by Grey Matter Interactive, was released, which had the same formula as always, Blazkowicz versus the Nazis, only this time having elements of occultism. In other words, the Nazis aren't the only monsters. It's not necessarily a sequel to the previous games, but rather an adaptation of past themes, Nazism, violence, and BJ Blazkowicz as the protagonist, to a new century. Fast forward a few years, more precisely in 2009, the talented Raven Software launches a game called simply Wolfenstein. This version is a new reading of the elements of the saga, adapting what was done in the last game to a rhythm that resembles the BioShock franchise, and also the wonderful Singularity from Raven itself. This video is not about it, but if you can, give the game a chance, please, it's quite good. All the games cited as part of the franchise are quite fun, and I recommend you try to give each one of them a chance, at least to see what Wolfenstein was at a certain point in the history of games. But one may ask, what do they have in common between them? Honestly, they are all made of the same three elements: combat, Nazis, and Blazkowicz. Whereas the beginning of the 3D scenarios for shooting games back in '92, or with what was the most modern in 2001, Wolfenstein's historical heritage was always present. So, when the not so well-known developer Machine Games, formed by people responsible for excellent games like the Chronicles of Riddick and The Darkness, was chosen to create the newest game in the Wolfenstein saga, their reaction was a cautious optimism. After all, for all the material available, at least the game would be stylish. Only, no one could imagine how amazing the new saga would end up being. With an engaging and deep plot, along with an amazing gameplay, Wolfenstein stands today side by side with Doom as one of the best shooters available, embracing the future, sometimes a little bit too much, without forgetting its origins. And well, although this video isn't about what Wolfenstein was, but about what the saga is, the first game we're going to talk about addresses exactly that: what the franchise once was, and what it's going to become. I like compilations. A lot. You know those editions that are actually a package with many games? I think they're really cool. However, my favorites are the ones that do something else. Those who present a little of the history of the franchise and the company that made them. An excellent example is the collection of the games of the Contra franchise. It not only brings, in a convenient package, wonderful versions of works that have marked the industry, but is also almost a documentary of the evolution of the saga and the media. I'm bringing this up because Wolfenstein: The Old Blood is an excellent collection of all the saga was until then, besides being a game of its own. Let me explain. Released in 2015, this game came to the world after the first one of the new Wolfenstein franchise, called The New Order, which was released in 2014. However, not only does the plot take place before the first game of this new beginning, but its mechanics and themes are much better enjoyed if you play before, so let's talk about it first. The year is 1946, and the Allies are losing the war. In a desperate move, two spies, one of them being B.J. Blazkowicz, must infiltrate Castle Wolfenstein and steal the documents with the location of one of the greatest leaders of the Nazi army, Wilhelm Strasse, known as Death Shed. Okay, fine, but what makes this game a compilation? Simple, its structure and themes. I don't have to say that the plan doesn't go 100% as expected, so we're going to have to sneak out of the castle's dungeons. What happens here is nothing more than a high-definition version of Castle Wolfenstein from 1981. After that, having access to more weapons and equipment, the action begins to happen. We start fighting Nazis and friends in gunfights as we find our way through the fortress, just like Wolfenstein 3D. Finally, away from the castle, the occult shows its face as dark forces haunt a small town, as it did in Return to Castle Wolfenstein and the 2009 game. Therefore, Machine Games manages, with great elegance, to bring to modernity the diverse and, in a way, conflicting elements of the whole saga through an excellent game, which is as much a tribute to the past as the beginning of the future. But how are you going to escape the castle and face the forces of evil? I mean, how do you play that? I'm so glad you asked. In a simplified way, it is a shooting game with stealth elements, but talking like that doesn't live up to the quality. The weapons are carefully crafted so that the simple act of shooting is engaging. Shots at the Nazi cause pieces of armor and even limbs to fly away. The recoil that each shot causes is heavy and impactful, helping in the sense of handling objects that are as powerful as lethal. Having in your inventory a machine gun and picking up another one does not translate only into more ammunition, but rather the possibility of wielding two guns at the same time. This also applies to shotguns, rifles, and pistols. Hand-to-hand combat are brutal moments in which Blazkowicz and his opponent stab each other to see who dies first, and always culminating in visceral executions. A very interesting point is that, although the protagonist is a wall of muscles, he is very fragile, with few shots being enough to take him to the ground. Just like real life, look at that! What's interesting is that, just like your counter of 100 health and armor can go to zero pretty fast, this is also true for your enemies. That way, combat is as lethal to you as it is to your opponents, and consequently, every victory feels deserved. The feeling of having triumphed before something that was really close to beat you is present in the whole new saga, but in the midst of gunfire and explosions, there's a stealth system. You often be in places where enemies don't know you are there, allowing you to silently take them down. One could call the system simplistic. After all, it is entirely based on walking crouched using a silenced pistol or a knife. And well, that person would be right. This aspect of the game is so simple that the patrolling enemies completely ignore the downed colleagues. The only difference is that there's a type of opponent, the commander, who, if he sees you, will take refuge somewhere and call for reinforcements until he's exterminated. The system is in fact simplistic, but that makes it work perfectly. It may not be deep, but will never disrupt the gameplay or break the rhythm of the game. It is not as rich as the gunplay, but it's pretty cool and the games of the saga incorporate it very well. Except when they don't, but that's for later. Along with that, we have the progression system. Unlike games with similar systems, which typically focus on accumulation of experience and exchange of said experience for skills, Wolfenstein rewards achievements. Defeat X number of enemies stealthily while your health is above the basic limit, and you'll be rewarded with a skill. It is a system that generally reinforces the engagement on the part of those who play and makes Wolfenstein stand out from similar games. The only problem is that certain requirements are very inconvenient, and normally you wouldn't perform them if the game didn't require to do so. So much so that you'll probably never repeat those actions after you get the skills, like the ones that require to defeat enemies while sliding or dropping grenades from their hands. And well, with all these elements united, you end up entering the protagonist's mind and agreeing with a truth that should not be controversial. Beating Nazis is a lot of fun.
Unless you have to.
What's that? Kill as many Nazis as I can?
No, I said...
Can't hear you, Kessler. Lots of static.
When Blazkowicz makes funny comments about his fight, you understand the feeling through the mechanics of the game. Blazkowicz is clearly having fun, and so are you. Anyway, summing up the combat, it's intoxicating. Now, speaking about the protagonist, it would be a crime to ignore him. If the games from 2001 and 2009 were the ones that gave him a voice, the new saga was the one that gave him a personality. More than a war machine or super soldier, Blazkowicz is a person. Even if he makes some funny remarks here and there, he often gets lost in intimate and melancholy thoughts, showing to be someone with aspirations, desires, and fears. This also applies to all the characters we encounter in the game. Although All the Blood is a short work with greater focus on action, the little time you spend with other people is more than enough to show that they are, well, people. Thus, even here, in the chronological beginning, the new saga shines by demonstrating its greatest talent, to perfectly balance tones and themes that one might call incompatible, but complete each other and create something unique. Seriousness with mockery, joy with tragedy, and in a way that applies to the pace of the game. Stopping to think about what happens in the short campaign, it seems like something that someone who doesn't know video games imagines what they look like. Escape from the Nazi castle, the assault on the besieged city, the zombie attack. And that's exactly it. Old Blood is a gigantic and passionate tribute to everything Wolfenstein once was. But the game is also something else. Throughout the journey, a shadow hangs above everything, above all the exaggerations and funny moments. You realize you are always late, arriving just after the tragedy occurs. People who are now charismatic and multidimensional suffer and fail. Even if you arrive by sliding on the ground with a shotgun in each hand, killing everything you see, it's often not enough to save a life. And BJ kills an absurd amount of Nazis, a comically absurd amount. There's never a feeling that you are freeing the regions from them, just that you are running away. But there will always be others, getting to the point that you see the inevitable already in the beginning of the new saga. The Nazis, or rather, the ideal that unites and defines them, will conquer the world. Although the game ends with the mission accomplished, Deathshed's secret location in the hands of the Allies, much has been lost. As we watch Blazkowicz fly to the horizon with what's left of the Allied army, we can see the series abandon the narrative and structural limitations of the past for the sake of something new. Something undeniably gloomy and melancholy, but also wonderful and inspiring. The saga is moving towards a new order. Already in the first minutes of Wolfenstein: The New Order, the game shows the quality and the new face of the saga with unexpected talent. The great battle to defeat one of the greatest figures of the Nazi Empire is taking place. The Allied army is using its entire structure in one last desperate attack that may as well change the course of the war. The assault that only came into existence because of the events of the Old Blood is in full swing. And it's not going well. If you're playing the saga as we've shown in this video, you've seen in the Old Blood most of the opponents you face here, but you didn't see the scale. The Allies, even using everything they have, are simply massacred by a force that seems to be at least 20 years more advanced. Honestly, it looks like a clash between two nations in a strategy game, an Age of Empires like. Only, one of the players forgot to evolve their people and now civilization has to face, using spears and stones, lasers and robots. What's pretty special about this first moment is that it works like an excellent last stage for the Old Blood. In that game, the clash with a giant trap in Forgotten Catacombs served as an ending to the gameplay and paced the work wanted to present. But this first level, the assault doomed to failure, served as an end to the themes presented. BJ's eternal clash during World War II, portrayed in every single game in the franchise to date, will finally be in the past. And Blazkowicz is particularly tired of this fight. He didn't really want to be here. He desires a moment of peace, of harmony. His dreams not to kill more Nazis, but to spend a lazy afternoon with someone who loves him and who is loved by him. But the reality right now is different. Lives with futures full of possibilities are lost in absurd amounts, and BJ knows that if the Nazis are not stopped here and now, not only will this tragedy be repeated around the world, but that dream will not be lived by him or anyone else. Except, well, the Nazis. There will be no more beauty in the world. And that's why he keeps moving on, with a super machine gun in each hand, or sneaking around with a silenced pistol in hands and a knife in the teeth. He aspires a future in which he does not need to kill or suffer. But as long as there are people oppressing and growing through cruelty, Blazkowicz will face evil. Fortunately, he's very good at it. But as we said earlier, this is only the first level. The assault goes wrong and BJ is deeply injured by a shrapnel that hits his head, being taken to a coma. The world then changes. We are now in 1960. Nazism and its less exaggerated but equally toxic and destructive brother, fascism, are the ideals that rule the world. And it is in this reality in which fascism can be seen in everything, be it people, ideas or constructions, that Blazkowicz wakes up. Having been rescued by fishermen, he spends 14 years in a vegetative state in an asylum. But instead of being presented as a dark and evil place, the setting is shown as a genuine place of love, care and healing. This is mainly due to the family that looks over the place, a couple and their daughter, Anya, who has a deep affinity for BJ and, as we perceive by his monologues while paralyzed, the affection is reciprocal. We can see that the family is united by affection and kindness, so it is predictable that the asylum they own will be directed by the same values: affection and kindness. Unfortunately, such values tend to be destroyed by a Nazi-fascist world, and the same happens to the family. Over the years, Blazkowicz observes how the Nazi army is gradually taking the asylum's patients, maybe to be executed or, even more tragic, to suffer as guinea pigs for some sick experiment. But then comes a day, when the army arrives with a different goal, to close the asylum for good, and the patients, who are regarded by the world as a burden, will be summarily executed. As always, the owners protest. However, this time, the reaction is more dramatic. Anya's parents are murdered and she's on her way to be kidnapped. The combination of hatred, anger and disgust in Blazkowicz is enough to wake him from the coma and continue the work he left incomplete 14 years ago. Before we go any further, it would be wise to clarify one thing. Anya is by no means a damsel in distress. Of course, in this particular moment, she's helpless and in need of rescue. Which is not much different from what happened to BJ over the years. Think of this moment as a demonstration of the pillar of the loving relationship between them. Neither one of them would achieve what they will achieve throughout the saga if it were not for the support and help of each other.
One more thing. It's quite critical.
What?
That'll be all. We can go now.
Okay, let's take a break here. We've barely started talking about the New Order, and we already have tales of complex and deep people in situations that bring the best and worst of them. All the while we have moments where you can say, without sarcasm or exaggeration, "Damn, this cyber Nazi is very difficult to defeat. Maybe if I use a shotgun in each hand, I stand a chance." As has been said, the new saga of Wolfenstein balances themes and tones that could be considered opposites, but together form something unique and special. There is a criticism I see repeated in many publications and videos, that the presence of such distinct elements is something weak, is a mistake, that the game does not know what it wants to be or that confuses the people playing about how they should feel. So what does Wolfenstein wants to be? Is it an action or stealth game? Is it a tragic or hopeful story? Is Blazkowicz a melancholic or funny person? The answer is yes. The saga is all that. With all due respect to the people who share this criticism, but it's deeply misguided. It is based on the idea that a work cannot have more than one tone or more than one rhythm, and that's just not true. We could even argue that it's not even true for real life. In the space of a week, the same person can experience moments of joy, tragedy, hopefulness, sadness, comedy, and eroticism. Wolfenstein is not only an example of something that unites all those moments, but also does it quite well. This notion of being diverse things is something that the developer team also questioned and decided to embrace. And well, after a meeting with Anya's grandparents, in which Blazkowicz is updated on what happened to the world, the game adopts its main structure. Several actions and attacks with one of the last groups of rebels in several places of extreme importance to the Nazi Empire, including a lunar base. And this structural decision serves two fundamental aspects. In the eyes of the gameplay, it is an excellent excuse to have fights in very diverse places that contribute to different approaches. Sometimes a more claustrophobic place, sometimes a more open one, and another one with lower gravity. Artistically and narratively, it contributes to the beauty of the work. Wolfenstein is a beautiful game, not only from a technical point of view, but also artistic. The buildings are imposing and grand. They are beautiful to be seen and serve the narrative and, above all, the ideology addressed. You see, fortunately, governments that call themselves Nazi-fascists throughout history were few and also lasted a short time. Unfortunately, this makes the job of defining, satisfactorily and definitively, what makes a government fascist something somewhat complicated. However, one of the points that is safe to say that there are no controversies is that a fascist government is a government of appearances. You know when a guy buys a big car to compensate for a few things? So, a fascist government uses the image of being mighty through propaganda and architecture to compensate for its fragility. And that fragility is also exploited in the game. The type of concrete that the Nazis use in their Colossus structures, even though it manages to leave them standing, is moldy and fragile. The seemingly indestructible and imposing structures that sustain the Empire become dust with curious ease. It is also possible to hear several conversations from both soldiers and civilians, who comment on how, for some reason, it is getting complicated to breathe these days and an acquaintance who was once fully healthy is now feeling so weak. This theme fully reflects the way fascist governments present themselves. Let me share a real story about Brazil and an aviation company called Panair. The company has an extremely rich history, but what you need to know is that for much of the 20th century it was one of the greatest companies in Brazil and, in a sense, in the world. Not only was it considered a synonym with quality of service, thus creating the expression Panair Standard in Brazil for when something was very well done, but it was also synonymous with integration. You see, Brazil has always been and continues to be an extremely unequal country in many aspects, but here we will emphasize the geographical and the social. The south and southeast regions are historically more favored and emphasized by the national public policies, to the detriment and often ignoring the needs and longings of the rest of the nation. And well, Panair did things differently. Most cities in the northern regions of Brazil, especially in the state of Amazonas, simply do not have airports and they are not accessible by land, only by rivers. Therefore, one of the most valuable qualities from a social point of view was its fleet of hydroplanes, which guaranteed not only access to previously ignored regions, but such access was fast and feasible. With its invaluable importance to the country, it is deeply tragic that it was destroyed overnight. After the military coup, Brazil spent 20 years, from 1964 to 1985, suffering a fascist regime which was marked by censorship, torture, and death. In the midst of all this, there was the fact that Pan-Air and the military did not get along very well. Then, on a beautiful day, in 1965, Pan-Air was surprised by the news that its bankruptcy had been declared and it was forbidden to fly. Obviously, it was all a lie. The government just wanted a way to get rid of something powerful that would go against their will and to favor something that would improve its image. And that's exactly what happened. On the same day that Pan-Air lost its right to fly, the international lines were passed to another company, one more favorable to the government, called Varig. Much of Pan-Air's structure and materials were transferred to this other company. Varig's relationship with the military was so intimate that the 20 years of dictatorship in Brazil were considered its golden age. Varig could do whatever it wanted and charge as much as it wanted. Using what's left of Pan-Air, the sky was literally the limit. In return, the company did what the government wanted, and more importantly, glorified the image of the regime. Therefore, the idea that with the military in power Brazil was flying higher was propagated worldwide. However, just as Wolfenstein's concrete is bound to contaminate and decay, the false grandeur of this golden age of aviation would end. With the end of the military dictatorship, this super company, having achieved its absurd size through lies and the destruction of something true, could not keep up with the changes brought by the times and by the world. It slowly declined, and its bankruptcy was enacted in 2006. And that aspect of the greatness of a fascist government being achieved by taking something also occurs in the game. After an excellent mission in a concentration camp, we discovered that the impossible technological creations of the Nazis were only created using the notes and structures of an ancient secret society, which craved many things, except conflict or wars. And the glue that unites all these narrative and thematic elements, which involve everything from ideological reflections to conspiracy theories, are the characters. Back in Youngblood, even with little screen time, the people we interacted with appear to be much more than one-dimensional characters from a war game. In New Order, with its longer duration and focus on the story, each and every person adds something to the world. We've talked a lot here about Blazkowicz and Anya, but we also have Caroline Baker, who is responsible for leading the resistance and is a former acquaintance of BJ, who, like him, was also wounded by the war. However, the fact that she's in a wheelchair is, at most, a mere inconvenience that does not prevent her from leading and especially fighting. Another absurdly interesting character is Max Haas. You see, Max was born with a brain damage, causing the doctors to have to remove a part of the organ. The result is that his ability to express himself orally ended up being limited, being able to speak only his name. There is also the fact that his way of behaving reflects that of a child. If Wolfenstein were a predictable or weak work, Max Haas would stop here. He would be presented as the poor disabled who must be protected and is a nuisance to the group. But Wolfenstein is not weak, much less predictable. Max is a deeply intelligent person, and as the sequel reveals, he's also wise and artistically talented. Besides, he's responsible, more than once, for saving BJ's life. The series demonstrates, through Max, even if not intentionally, that we all face obstacles. Some people, unfortunately and unfairly, end up facing some particularly more inconvenient. But that doesn't mean that such people are not able to care, shelter, and protect. We also have the charismatic Bombate, which I will not devote so many words to the challenges he faces because, honestly, I believe I don't need to explain why a black man from Namibia would face certain adversities in a war taken over by the Nazis. And lastly, we have the Survivor. At the end of the first level, we are presented with a choice, who, from two of BJ's allies, must die at the hands of Deathshed. This choice makes the timeline of the game split between the path of the young American Wyatt or the Scottish war veteran Fergus. Such choice affects the design of the game in a simple way. A slight change in the course of a level, a different minigame, and the possibility of improving either your health or armor. Now, narratively, things change. Of course, the story will be the same, but a considerable part of the dialogues and even a particular secondary character will be different. What doesn't change is the guilt that each one feels. Regardless of the choice, the survivor will believe that you have chosen wrong. Fergus thinks you put a broken, tired man to do the job that should be for the new generation, while Wyatt thinks you put a boy to do a man's job. Whoever the survivor is going to be a psychologically shaken person with a serious case of, well, survivor's guilt. Okay, but what do these people have in common? Simple. They are everything that Nazism considers weak. The resistance is made of women, people of color, people with disabilities, and, depending on your choice, a depressed Scotsman. The ideal that governs the world considers all these people as inferior, incapable, and disposable. But here they are, working together and challenging the impossible. Every step the resistance takes demonstrates, by itself, how wrong the Nazis are, and that, perhaps, who knows, maybe it is possible to change things. And this, all of this, is Wolfenstein. It's a visceral shooting game with a sense of gameplay and pace almost unmatched. It's also a story about people, flawed and ordinary people, like you and me, and about how they face, and against all the expectations, triumph against a world that believes that they are inferior and doomed to failure. Don't get me wrong, our heroes suffer. When they are not nearly on the ground with the weight of the reality that burdens them, they are almost on the ground taking cover from shots, explosions, and lasers. Wolfenstein: The New Order is a rare case of a work that successfully balances everything it tries to do: gameplay, story, and design. If it had already existed itself and its expansion, the Youngblood, it would be alright. The new saga would not have gone so far in the topics covered, that's true, but it would have gone far enough. Fortunately, the new saga continues. The next battle will be against an enemy far more powerful than a Nazi scientist and his army of monstrous creations. It will be a battle against an ideal. Wolfenstein II: The New Colossus is a much bolder game than its predecessor in many ways. For the better and for the worse. Blazkowicz is broken, physically and emotionally. Yes, he managed to defeat his nemesis and to seriously damage the production of advanced technology for the Nazis. But at the end of the day, Death Shed was just one person. Nazism, on the other hand, is an ideal. And if it was already complicated for the Big J of previous games to face something like that, now, more than ever, it seems impossible. When I say he's broken, it's in the sense of almost dead. After the events of the last game, he got physically debilitated, having numerous fractures, damage to many organs, and not being able to walk anymore. And because of this, he constantly contemplates that the end of his life is already coming. But hey, BJ is still BJ. So as long as there are Nazis to kill, he's going to kill. And that's why he continues, with one hand holding a machine gun and the other pushing his wheelchair forward. And we, as players, also share the fragility. For a considerable part of the game, the character's health is limited to 50 life points, as opposed to the 100 of the previous games. At least you can accumulate 200 armor points, but even this protection carries something tragic. Caroline Baker, the leader of the rebellion and responsible for guiding the group through the most difficult moments, dies at the beginning of the game by the hands of Irene Engel, a secondary villain in the previous stories that assumes the role of the main antagonist. Well, technically, but we'll talk about it later. What happens is that BJ goes on to wear the armor Becker used to accomplish superhuman feats. Now, I'd like to take some time to talk about the gameplay. You see, the game essentially maintains the same way of playing as its predecessors, but it makes small changes that individually do not impact it so much. But together, unfortunately, they collaborate to make the moments of frustration more present. One of the main reasons for this is how stealth has been addressed. Enemies have become smarter, with shorter response times, and now have the ability to enter a keener surveillance state when they encounter a downed companion. In other words, the system became more complex, but your abilities remain the same. Along with this, we have the design of the levels that puts you in some situations where there is no possibility for not being seen, resulting in moments that you will inevitably have to run madly after the commanders who, as long as they are not shot down, will be calling for reinforcements. And the result of all this, combined with the rebalance of health, is a rhythm in which you end up being discovered with inconvenient and unfair frequency, having to run after the commanders ended up dying, because the endless horde of enemies does not match very well with the fragile state of BJ. Obviously, this doesn't happen all the time, but it happens enough to be frustrating. Another thing, normally I would not talk about a super specific point as a kind of boring enemy, but since even the developers said it was not well implemented, I give myself that right. There's this thing, the Laser Hound, which is a little dog-like robot that shoots a laser. In the main campaign he appears very few times actually, but when he does, my friends, you see, he's absurdly fast and he's always going right at you. Along with the fact that he's pretty tough, which means that he's going to catch up with you. But the cool part comes now. He has a dash that always manages to take you down, leaving you motionless for a few seconds as he prepares his extremely strong shot. Okay, then you say, no problem Chronica, put a shotgun in each hand and it is problem solved. Well, when it is shot down, it explodes, killing you. Oh, and he's hardly ever alone. The very few moments in which you face this little dude are incredibly frustrating. I mean it, beautiful people. Actually, there is this moment here that if all goes well, is going to be shown now. It may not seem like much, but it took many attempts to get through there, because it has everything bad in the game condensed in a small room. Stealth moment virtually impossible to pass, a commander right at the end who will keep calling reinforcements, and a damn laser hound. What's fun is that the issue of the game being more complex, however your skills are not, is resolved after a while, by the game itself. At a given time, you'll be able to choose one of 3 icons called contraptions. Each one of them allows you to interact with the scenery differently. One allows you to pass through tight places, the other knocks down walls, and the third allows you to get taller. It may not sound useful, but I swear it's actually cool. But the interesting thing is that each one of them also carries with it an ability that makes the game more interesting and balanced. One makes the time slower moments before an enemy detects you, allowing you to shoot him down or hide. Another slows down time while you choose your weapons, and finally, one regenerates a small part of your armor. As I was unlocking each one, I couldn't help but think that if the game had started with those abilities, the experience would be much better. After finishing the game, I was sure. You can buy, as the old world content, little fictional stories from the game world, as if they were comic books that the people from Wolfenstein read, which last a maximum of 2 hours each. The funny thing is that, from the beginning of those stories, some of the skills that I mentioned are already unlocked, and the result is a much more enjoyable experience. Remember when I said that the little things alone don't get in the way of the game, but together? The best way I have to define my opinion of all this is, after finishing the New Order and the Old Blood, I have the desire to immediately play again at maximum difficulty. But in the new Colossus, especially if you are playing on a console, the toughest difficulty that I recommend before getting very frustrating is the hard level. Wow, after talking for so long about what I don't think was well implemented, it seems like I didn't like the game, doesn't it? Well, on the contrary, I love it. I strongly recommend that you play all the games represented here. After all, the video does not have the name it has for nothing. But it would be completely disrespectful to you if I didn't talk about the moments of the series, well, as we say around here, farts on the farofa. And I will not elaborate on that. Fortunately, the story fares much better than the gameplay in the face of the new changes. As we said in the beginning of this act, the situation is very dire, both for the Resistance and for BJ. And the game uses this strategic and emotional fragility as a starting point to explore extremely delicate subjects. For example, Anya is pregnant with twins. Very soon, they will be parents. While she does manage to balance motherhood and the fight against Nazi fascism, BJ is haunted by his fragility and by his past. Throughout the game, we are constantly introduced to memories of Blazkowicz's childhood, and many of them are painful. His father, Rip, is a white American man who believes that because he is a white American man, the world must obey and favor him. So when the world doesn't revolve around him, Obviously, in his eyes, it's the fault of the others. It's the fault of the blacks, the Jews, the gays, the old, and the weak. He's the kind of person who attacks his wife and child and kills his dog just to try to demonstrate that his opinions and visions are right. In his words, the old and the weak are doomed. So it's not surprising that fatherhood scares BJ, not only because of the notion of leaving his daughters orphaned, but by the fear of walking on the same footsteps as his father. That is the kind of person who raised Blazkowicz. But don't think his past was solely sad, for he was also raised by his mother. Zofia was a Jewish woman of Polish descent, who taught her son about love, compassion, and affection. Despite the trauma caused by his father, we can see that the parental figure that had the strongest impact on who BJ ended up being was his mother. And in the end, we have the Blazkowicz who, whether he likes or not, is the son of both his parents. He carries with him the love for the world and for the people from his mother, but he also carries the notion, passed by his father, that by force and violence, someone can get what they want. Fortunately, what BJ wants the most is to protect the people and the world, defending, mainly, the old and the weak. But the views and opinions that must be addressed are not only those of a person's past. After the events of the first levels, we can walk freely through the new base of operations of the Resistance, the submarine Eva's Hammer. And it's sad how empty it is. We can see that the rebellion is not only without leadership, but also without people. The impression that we get is that of a house without enough inhabitants. Rooms are empty and many remain locked as there are no people to occupy them. Even the shooting range reflects this. The leaderboards have very few people and the best times and scores are very low. It is comically easy to stay in first place. In this way, you, as a player, realize how important the search for new leadership is, as it will not only bring a new goal to the rebellion, but also a new life. But what neither anyone who's playing nor BJ expected was for it to bring a new worldview. Grace Walker, the head of the resistance cell located in what's left of Manhattan, is a born leader. Her presence in the game brings a new side of life to the main group and a new hope in the fight to liberate the United States from Nazi fascism. But even more importantly, she's a black woman. Look, Blazkowicz is a white guy. But not just that, he's a wall of muscles with blonde hair and blue eyes, not far from the Nazi ideals of what a Superman should be. He constantly comments on reigniting the fighting spirit in the hearts of Americans. But Grace gives a necessary touch of reality. In case you chose to stay quiet in the previous game, an American character named Jay will be presented in New Order, and like Grace, he is black. At one point, while Blazkowicz talks about how he wants to make things go back to what they were before, Jay interrupts him and comments that, for people like him, things haven't changed much with the Nazis. The difference is that the prejudice and subhuman treatment now occur around the globe. Before Nazism took over the world, for people like Jay, the Nazis were already in the United States. A cool detail is that the game kind of implies that this guy is Jimi Hendrix. Another thing, I will always love the part where Grace is introduced, because it is in it that we have one of the best lines of Blazkowicz, and dare I say, in gaming.
Come and fucking get me, you white-ass fascist Nazi pigs!
Well, that point, which the previous game touches lightly, is more clearly addressed here. Grace reminds BJ that the white American man's fighting spirit quickly disappeared. When the Nazi army arrived in the United States, offering to take away the Jews, gays, and blacks, suddenly, to a considerable part of Americans, speaking German did not seem to be so complicated. And that's one aspect of the reality and his worldview that BJ must face. The game even devotes the starring moments of Roosevelt's stage to demonstrate this. In this small fragment of the chapter there's no combat, just a demonstration of everyday life in a United States dominated by Nazism. The darkest part of this moment in the game is how comfortable everything appears to be, at least on the surface. People casually talk about black slaves. A newspaper salesman announces the regime's victories. Two friends dressed in Ku Klux Klan robes casually walk down the street, and a young woman flirts with a Nazi commander. However, look at each of these cases and you'll be able to see how false everything is. The two members of the clan are approached by a Nazi soldier who ridicules their pronunciation of the German language, remembering that it is a good idea to practice, because soon, English will be abandoned. The girl courting the commander makes an unfortunate comment and is threatened and placed under surveillance. The newspaper salesman realizes that he is facing the great terrorist known as Terror Billy and whispers that he is 100% on our side. This moment demonstrates how a false reality, constructed through lies, demonstrations of power, and threats of violence will always be doomed to failure. On the other hand, we are shown how something genuine and true can positively influence someone. On a visit to the house where BJ spent his childhood, more than remembering how toxic his father was, we are introduced to the memories of a friend, a black girl also named Billy. And every interaction BJ had with her gradually made him a better person. In the first memory, the little Blazkowicz completely abandons the seed of racism that his father planted on his mind. In another, he realized that it's possible for another person to like him. And in the last one, a mouse falls into a bucket full of water and begins to drown. BJ finds the funniest thing in the world, calls Billy to see it, and she reacts with horror. This act of seeing a rat drown and find it funny is exactly the kind of father-son activity that Rip would approve. But with the influence of Billy, BJ saves the animal and realizes that it's good to protect and help something.
You done did it, Billy. You saved his life. Little guy.
And this notion of diverse and positive influences changing someone or something for the better permeates various aspects of the game. Grace Walker changed Blazkowicz and the rebellion as a whole. Now they have a clear purpose and direction in the fight to liberate the United States. Later in the campaign, we bring to the resistance a group of communists fighting against the regime in New Orleans. And this group's distinct view of what the country was and what it should be, which is almost antagonistic to Blazkowicz, also affects BJ. The submarine itself changes. The corridors come to have more life. Rooms are open and occupied by skilled people. Individuals with different life stories exchange experience about their lives. Even the shooting range evolves. The more people come in, more names are put on the scoreboard, with even higher scores. Even people who are already there have their results improved as time goes by. You and, consequently, BJ want to increase performance and become better warriors because of this positive influence. There is also a really cool character named Sigrun. She's one of the villain's daughters and joins the resistance at the beginning of the adventure. She begins the journey very insecure, having a negative idea of herself because of her toxic raising, and the mistrust which part of the resistance initially treats her. I'd like to point out a very interesting detail. The Nazis constantly make fun of her weight, diminishing her for being chubby. However, this is never repeated by the resistance, proving, once and for all, that being fat-phobic and mocking someone for their body is a Nazi thing. Over time, she manages to find her place in the group and plays a key role in the beginning of the fall of the Nazi fascist empire. However, her best moment is when she gets fed up with the way Grace treats her, who constantly calls her a Nazi, and ends up exploding, attacking her verbally and physically, while claiming that she is not a Nazi and will not accept being treated as such. This moment is fundamental not only to demonstrate how Sigrun was able to prove to the others that she really hates Nazism and believes in the cause of the resistance, but also managed to prove to herself that she'll no longer face abuses and indifference quietly. But in the midst of the story of overcoming and evolving, we have someone who doesn't change. We have BJ's father. Those toxic values we see in flashbacks flourish in the new reality. What for many is a world of suffering and injustice, for Rip Blazkowicz is a world of opportunity. The cruelest part of this character? He even had positive moments. The game addresses an issue that many people forget. A bad person is not like a generic villain of fiction. Someone bad, someone evil is a person. A person not unlike me and you, but who surrenders and follows a set of beliefs and values that put their own benefits above all else. Ah, but a person likes a thing just like me, or that guy or gal was nice or kind to me that one time. Can't be a bad person. Unfortunately, they can. Don't be fooled by a little trait that appears to be kindness, or a feature that is pleasing to the eye. The new Wolfenstein saga is known for exaggerated, explosive, and surreal moments. However, in my humble opinion, one of the most shocking moments in the franchise so far occurs, surprisingly, in the Youngblood. There's a moment when Blazkowicz disguises himself as a waiter and infiltrates a tavern full of Nazis, and they are just enjoying the afternoon. There are no scenes of torture or suffering. Just people talking about the days, about distant loves, sharing sorrows, and telling jokes. Just people on a nice afternoon. This moment is shocking because it shows one of the most tragic and dark aspects about those who join the regime. They are simply people, like you and me, with the potential to be good or simply pleasant, but have accepted to oppress and make suffer in exchange for a little power or authority. And the resistance stands as the absolute opposite of all these negative aspects, almost as an answer to the saying of BJ's father. The old and the weak are doomed? Look, there is a group made almost entirely of old and weak people who are demolishing all the structures, whether literal or social, built by the Nazis. And so, the central theme of the game has its conclusion. BJ's internal struggle to find a motivation to stay alive and evolve as a person also takes place at the national level. Wolfenstein: The New Colossus is not a game about freeing the United States from a Nazi-fascist regime, but about making a nation find the desire to free itself from a Nazi-fascist regime. It's not about making things go back to the way they were before, because the regime only settled so well and so comfortably on American soil because of the way things were before. The struggle is to change, to evolve. It is as much for BJ to become a better person as to make his country a better nation. But wait a minute. Face Nazi fascism, a female and black leadership exalting the old and the weak. Is Wolfenstein, by any chance, a political game? Oh no! In 2017, a few days before the release of the new Colossus, Wolfenstein's official Twitter account posted a short video in anticipation of the game, along with an equally short sentence. Make America Nazi-free again. I will not say here that Twitter stopped or exploded with this message, but it made enough noise not only to appear on various gaming sites, but also in publications that normally would not talk about it. The furor of this message is not very difficult to understand when you look at the times. The phrase is a clear adaptation of Donald Trump's political model, and the reason for the critics was that the developers of the game were, through their work, directly attacking supporters of the former president. Now, look, games are complicated to make. Very complicated and time-consuming. Wolfenstein II began development shortly after the release of the first, back in 2014, with the team split between the sequel and the Youngblood. So, how did they make a game that could address the political reality of the United States of 3 years in the future? Simple. In the same way that they managed to make a game that reflects what happened with the Brazilian company Pan-Air back in the 20th century, and at the same time addresses the reality of several countries in the world, including Brazil. Because, well, they didn't make a game about it specifically. What I'm going to say may be shocking for some, so be careful not to fall off the chair, bed, or drop your phone. The new Wolfenstein franchise is not just about killing Nazis and fascists. It's about confronting Nazism and fascism. And that makes all the difference. You see, a Nazi doesn't bite someone and that other person becomes contaminated by the idea. The game knows it. Nazism and fascism are a set of ideas and values that people seeking power, authority, superiority, or something like that embrace. And the game stands against all that. So, inevitably, when an event has a little bit of fascism, when a government glorifies a mythical past, or when a group of people advocates for racial or sexual superiority, or diminishes another group, know that Wolfenstein and BJ will be against everything and everyone who stands by that. It's part of the game. Not talking about it would be not talking about Wolfenstein. And it's actually good to know that this desire to resist against what's wrong has passed from parents to daughters. In case you are familiar with Wolfenstein Youngblood, there's a strong chance that you expect this moment of our conversation to be a more negative. For those unfamiliar, here's the abridged version. Youngblood is for the new Colossus what the Old Blood was for the New Order, an expansion of the game, focused on the action. Only this time, it's a two-person co-op game. However, when compared to the previous ones, the game was heavily criticized, and rightly so. Several design choices seem to have been very unfortunate, among which you can cite here a bad artificial intelligence for the second character when we are playing solo, the balancing of the fights against the bosses, the absence of checkpoints in longer stages, meaning that if you lost all your lives, you'd have to return to the beginning, and the non-redistribution of ammunition in stages after your defeat, which meant that if you lost, you'd have to play the same part with very low ammo. But undoubtedly, one of the most problematic aspects appears to have been the enemy's armor system. Several opponents have one of two types of armor, and consequently, certain weapons are strong or weak against each of the types. The problem was the fact that using an incorrect weapon was useless. The damage was almost non-existent. Now, this design choice, along with the ammo problem in the game world, and the fact that changing weapons wasn't fast, made you come across situations that you couldn't damage an opponent, because the ideal weapon was out of ammo, or when it had, the exchange of weapons made you very vulnerable to enemy attacks. You may have noticed that I used many verbs in the past in words like appear, and that wasn't for nothing. It's because I didn't play that game. Actually, I can't play it, and neither can you. You see, Youngblood can be defined as a game as a service. This definition exists for games that has as one of its fundamental pillars the notion of making routinely return to play, so that you can complete in daily or weekly challenges, participate in events, and mainly spend real money. Youngblood has it all. But I must make it clear that the function of spending real money is absurdly optional. However, it is there. One of the few positives that games like this have is the ability to improve. Through updates, systems can be refined, errors fixed, decisions balanced, and content added. This is possible to happen with any game. However, in those that are games as a service, this is a little bit more likely to happen. And that's what happened to Youngblood. This game that has received so many negative reviews simply no longer exists. Machine Games modified the entire game. Your partner's AI is so good that I may as well consider one of the most efficient helpers I've had in a game. The checkpoint system, armor distribution, and boss fights have been completely rebalanced to offer a fairer and more fun experience. The armor system still exists, but the damage of a non-ideal weapon has been adjusted to be extremely efficient, along with the fact that changing weapons is now much faster. Even the stealth system has been improved when compared to the previous game, with invisibility options and more types of eliminations. Not to mention that, by making all enemies able to call a limited number of reinforcements when they detect you, the game transforms what would once be a mad race to the commander, which now only makes such reinforcements stronger, into a battle that you know will end, and therefore you can use several strategies. Oh, and now, playing alone, you can pause, which you couldn't before. The result? Most likely the best game in the franchise when talking about raw combat and gameplay. Ah, so you mean the game's perfect? Unfortunately, no. Unlike previous games, which have a mainly linear structure, in which you go from level to level until you complete the game, Youngblood has a semi-open world. Let me elaborate. After the first stage, you start at the Resistance headquarters in France, accepting side missions and the like, and from there, you choose which of the game's 3 neighborhoods to visit, which are connected to the campaign's main levels. All these scenarios are extremely beautiful and painstakingly well made. Arcane Studios, developer of the phenomenal Dishonored, contribute to the elaboration of the place, and well, it shows. The problem is that the game will make you return numerous times to the same locations, with the aim of doing side missions and or evolving your character to be able to perform well in the more difficult stages. The game abandons the progression system based on the player's achievements to adopt a more orthodox, experience-based one. This design choice alone is not bad or wrong. Many games work in similar fashion. The point is, between the pace of previous games or the more open of this one, I strongly believe that Machine Games has more talent making a more linear experience. In other words, finishing all the main and secondary missions took me 14 hours. Those were 14 wonderful hours with one of the best versions of the franchise's combat system. But I will trade, in a heartbeat, those 14 hours of a repetitive semi-open world game for 7 hours of a single linear experience. At least we spent those 14 hours in good company. Since Youngblood takes place 20 years after the new Colossus, the twins who were not yet born in that game are now adults. Zofia and Jesse Blazkowicz are extremely charismatic characters who talk throughout the game, constantly irritating and supporting each other, telling jokes that are sometimes funny, others funny only for them, and sometimes very dull, but all in a natural and warm way. I'm kinda suspicious to talk about them because, honestly, They are female versions of Bill and Ted, who I like so much that I put in the introductions to my videos.
No way!
There is an understandable criticism that this more playful way is inferior to BJ's sorrowful in previous games. I understand that, really, but I believe that through them, and the way they talk, the game shows how the world and people have changed. BJ, for example, didn't have the sad, introspective monologues because it was cool. His lonely moments were melancholy because the world was melancholy. His only perspective of life was struggle. The dream of living a life in peace with his family was just that, a dream. Not to mention his raising, which haunted him for much of his life. But Jess and Soph aren't like that, because the world isn't like that. They had a childhood, they have tastes and goals that go far beyond killing more Nazis. The battles our heroes fought so desperately throughout the new saga were worth it. The new generation has a future. The world is not perfect, but it has changed enough to allow two girls to be, in a considerable way, just two girls, with no dark past or overwhelming tragedies. Anya and BJ were great parents. More than genes, they have passed forward positive and healthy values and ideals. That's why, the moment their father disappears, our new heroes don't take long to act. You see, the plot of the game is very short when compared to the rest of the saga. There are cutscenes at the beginning and the final stretch, leaving the medium very scarce in the area of story progression and character development. As I said earlier, I would prefer a more linear approach, similar to the last few games. But that doesn't mean that what's here has no value. Far from it. BJ's gone. After weeks of showing strange sadness, he just disappeared. Following some clues, the girls eventually arrive in France and help the resistance of Paris in the fight against the Nazis while searching for their father. Although a considerable part of the game does not advance the plot, it doesn't mean that it lacks thematic relevance. The cooperation between the sisters and the link with the French resistance serves as a contrast to what's left of the regime. The Nazis are petty and selfish. Through the records scattered around the city, you realize they are unable to work as a team. So much so that the notion of betrayal is one of the main points of the villain's arc in the story. However, more than a contrast between the cooperation and assistance of the Blazkowicz sisters against the inevitable self-destruction of the Nazi-fascist regime, we have in BJ's melancholy another very important aspect of the story. After several revelations, we discover the reason for BJ's disappearance and what he was doing throughout the game. While the science fiction style motives are relevant to the direction the series will take, it is in the emotional aspect that the motivation behind BJ makes everything more understandable. He's being haunted by both the what-ifs of the past and by the fear of the future. Yes, his actions, whether explosive or kind, positively influence the world and allow those he loves to have an opportunity to simply live a good life. But, do you know when you remember your past and think, what if I had done things differently? Or, what if I had more time or opportunities? Even though he managed to fend off the Nazi-fascist threat, it cost him part of his life. So much time that was spent fighting and suffering could, in another reality, have been spent living. Not to mention the future, or rather, its absence. Apparently, the world is doomed. The apex of the Nazi egocentrism has been reached. If they can't have something, no one else can. After Hitler's death, a machine was activated, which will make the planet uninhabitable. In the face of all this, it is understandable that someone would want to escape this reality, and surprisingly, that's literally what BJ figured out how to do. How to flee to another world, a world without Nazism or fascism. I wholeheartedly understand the critics who found this point negative. The idea that the series will seek its conclusion by fleeing the world it created would considerably diminish the impact of the themes when compared to the possibility of continuing to face Nazi-fascist views in a mature and humane way, as it has done so far. It's just that the game doesn't end that way. The sisters confront their father about those fears. Unfortunately, they can't change the past, but they can face the future without having to run. Personally, I find that conclusion very powerful. The fact that they put the possibility of abandoning everything and escaping their world, but decide not to use it, demonstrates a commitment from both the developers of the saga they created and the characters with their world. Comically, this reflects a little bit of the game itself. Nothing the developers can do will undo many people's initial reaction to the game. You can't change the past. But they didn't abandon their creation. They heard all the criticism and kept polishing the game. It may not be the game that many fans imagined it would be. I mean, it's not the game I want it to be. But it's a great game, and the decisions made here leave me hopeful about what will come in the future. If you allow me to make one last comparison, do you remember Paner? Even after its closure, those responsible for the company didn't give up. They continued for decades trying to prove the crimes that were committed against it. And against all odds, they succeeded. Paner no longer flies, but it lives, in the form of an initiative that will assist entities and partners in the defense of civil and human rights. You can't undo all the damages and losses that happen over the course of a lifetime, or a game, but you can move on. Whether it's in an aviation company, a fictional character, or a game with some unfortunate design choices, even if the future isn't the way we imagine or want it to be, it's possible and necessary to make it the best it can be. Maybe not ideal, but the best possible. I think it must have been clear that I like Wolfenstein quite a lot. But it's really not my fault, the saga is easy to love. If you, like me, are a fan, I hope that with this video I managed to represent the reason why this franchise is so special to us. And in case you haven't given these games a chance, I'd be very happy if this video convinces you to try it. And look, if you play on your computer or Xbox, they are all available on Game Pass. There are very few works, especially games, that have the courage to present so much honesty, heart, and much exaggeration, besides taking risks in the sequences. In all honesty, some design decisions of the second game and Youngblood did not really please me, I believe I made that clear. But I'm happy to see the staff trying new things and not being ashamed to admit the mistakes. It makes me have an even greater respect for the team. As for what I expect from the future, that a good game may come, made with heart and without the fear of telling the story it wants to tell or using the mechanics it wants to use. It may even be the game of my dreams, with all the qualities I expect from a Wolfenstein. But it also wouldn't be all that bad to surprise me with something unexpected. As long as it keeps mixing action and stealth, humor and tragedy, doesn't be afraid to face Nazi fascism, racism, and other negative aspects of humanity, and keeps praising compassion, companionship, and hope, it will be alright. It's going to be Wolfenstein. Thanks for watching, really. And if you want, you can subscribe here on the channel and follow on social networks, but mainly on Twitter. I'd be very happy. But again, only if you feel like it. Oh, and if you'd like to see the beautiful people that helped make this video possible, check their contacts in the description. They're really nice and talented. Once again, thanks for watching. I mean it.